All right, so we're going to finish up the notes on page 40. So these ones down here, and I want to point out that these are ones, all these complex number ones are ones that you will see on the SAT, so I want to make sure you guys know how to do these. So when you have these i's, when you just have an I to the power of something, you are able to simplify them, okay? So let's see, when you have an I squared, we know already that I squared is equal to -1, right? But let's also think about, okay, well, like what would I cubed be equal to? All right, so we can kind of break that down. Well, I cubed would be equal to I squared times I, right? And we know that I squared is equal to -1, so it's actually just equal to -I. So you get I cubed is equal to -I. So you can simplify an I cubed to -I. All right. Then you have an I to the 4th. Okay. So think about it this way. You could break down an I to the 4th as I squared, which would give you -1 times -1, which would just give you 1. So I to the 4th power is equal to 1. So basically, what you're going to want to try and do here is break these down into I squared, I to the 3rd, and I to the 4th. And essentially what ends up happening is it starts repeating the pattern again, okay? So obviously we know that like I is equal to I, right? It's like duh. But then we have I to the 5th power. Let's think about it this way, right? We could break I to the 5th power down into I to the 4th times I, right? Well, what's I to the 4th equal to? 1. So we end up with 1 times I, and the cycle starts over again. So we'll go ahead and we're going to try and simplify these I values. So obviously I already gave you what I squared is, and hopefully you know that from our previous work with imaginary numbers. I squared is equal to -1. All right. Now for I cubed, right, we can break that down into I squared times I, which gives us -1 times I, which gives us -I. All right. Then I to the 4th. Again, I just showed you guys this, right? We could break this down into I squared times I squared. -1 times -1 gives us a +1. All right. And again, we had our I to the 5th. Break it down into I to the 4th, which we already know is equal to 1 times I. So you get 1 times I, which is just I. All right. So now let's try these other ones down here. And bear with me, you'll start to see a pattern. So what you want to do is you want to try and break these down into I squared, I to the 3rd, or I to the 4th. Now, I to the 4th is kind of the most useful one, right? Because that just breaks down into 1. So essentially what you're going to want to do is see, okay, well, how many I to the 4ths can I fit into I to the 24? Okay, so we would do I, and we know that if we had I to the 4th here, we could raise this to the 6th power, right? And this would give us I to the 24th. Well, we know that I to the 4th is equal to 1, right? So we could replace that I to the 4th with a 1, and we just get 1 as our answer. All right. Then for this I to the 35th power, again, we're going to try and put it in terms of I to the 4th. So let's try that. We'll do I to the 4th. And with 30, the highest we're going to get to, or with 35, the highest we're going to be able to get to here is going to be 32. All right, that'll get us to 32. And we've got 3 left over. So how did I do this? I did 4 times 8 gives me I to the 32. All right. I to the 3rd would get us to 35. So now we know that this guy is just going to go to 1. And we also know that I to the 3rd power is equal to -I, which is just going to give us a -I. All right. We'll go ahead and we'll try this next one. You have 113. All right. So what we can do here is we got to figure out, well, how many times can I fit a 4 into 113. All right. So honestly, one way you can do this when these numbers get really high, what I recommend doing is taking this number and dividing it by 4. Okay, so if we do 113 divided by 4, that gives us 28. Okay, so the 4 is going to go into there 28 times, right? So we'd have I to the 4th. It's going to give us a 28. Then we have a decimal. We have 28.25. All right, well, 4 times 28 gives us 112. So how many more do we need to get to 113? We just need one I. So then we end up with this guy goes to 1. You get I. Your answer is just I here. All right. All right. So I wanted to add to the notes in your packet. I wanted to do a couple more examples and just kind of show you, because these problems look hard, but they're really not that difficult once you kind of learn the pattern of them. So to reiterate, obviously I is going to be equal to I, but we also learned that I squared is equal to -1. I to the 3rd is equal to -I, and I to the 4th is equal to 1. Okay, that's what we learned from the notes. So now let's go ahead. We're going to try and break this down. Now, how I recommend doing this is taking this number and dividing by 4. Okay, and you'll see why. So you're going to do 73 divided by 4. And what that tells you is that I to the 4th goes in there 18 times. It's a decimal, but the whole number, right, the number before the decimal is going to tell you how many times 4 goes in there. So that means that we could do I to the 4th to the power of 18. Okay, now 4 times 18 is, oops, I clearly plugged that in wrong. 4 times 18 gives you 72. So this is our I. We get I to the 72. All right. Well, if we're at I to the 72, how many more do we need to get to 73? We need one more I. All right. And of course, we know that I to the 4th is equal to 1. 1 to the 18th power is 1, so we are left with just an I. All right. And if we go here, this again looks real scary, right? We got 259. Well, let's try it. We're going to do 259 divided by 4, and that gives us 64. So we're going to do I to the 4th raised to the power of 64. 4 times 64 is 256. So we got up to I to the power of 256. How many more do we need to get to 259? We're going to need 3 more. It's kind of like those remainders. Remember we were doing remainders? That's exactly like what this is. We're just calculating, how many times 4 goes in there, and then how many do we have left over. So this ends up going to just 1. And we know what I to the 3rd is, right? I to the 3rd is equal, if we look back here, to -I. So the answer for this guy is just -I. Let's try another one. We got I to the 24th. So we're going to do 24 divided by 4. That gives us 6. All right. So that tells us we've got I to the 4. We've got 6. And of course, this is equal to I to the 24th, right? We're right there, right? We don't have a remainder. And when you don't have a remainder, well, I to the 4th is equal to 1. So 1 to the 6th power is just going to give us 1. Let's try another one. I to the 16th. We're going to do 16 divided by 4. And you get 4. So we know I to the 4th raised to the 4th power gives us our I to the 16. Well, this is just equal to 1. So when the 4 divides in there evenly, your answer is automatically going to be 1. All right. I to the 543. Divide that by 4. We got 135. All right. 4 times 135 gets us to 540, which means we need 3 more. Our remainder is going to be 3. So we're going to have I to the 3rd. All right. This guy, we know that our I to the 4th goes to 1 times I to the 3rd. I to the 3rd is equal to -I. All right, let's do at least one more here. We got I to the 9th. So we're going to do 9 divided by 4, right? We get 2.25. So we're going to go ahead. We can do I to the 4th raised to the power of 2. That's going to get us to 8. So we need one more. We end up with 1 times I. Just going to give us I. So when you simplify these, you should be getting one of these answers. You should be either be getting I, -1, negative I, or 1. So let's go ahead. I want you to try some. So go ahead. This one looks scary, but you can do it. See if you could simplify I to the power of 834. So we're going to do 834 divided by 4, which gives us 208. So we're going to do I to the power of 4 raised to the power of 208. That gives us 208 times 4, gets us to 832. That's going to go ahead, and we're going to need 2 more, right? We're going to need I squared to get to 234 for 230, or 8, goodness. We're going to need 2 more to get to 834 for 832. This guy goes to 1, and we know that I squared is equal to -1. So our answer here is going to be -1. All right. Try this one. 55 divided by 4. We get 13. So we're going to do I to the 4th raised to the power of 13. Right, and 13 times 4 gets us to 52. So we're going to need 3 more. We get 1 times I to the 3rd. We know that I to the 3rd is equal to -I. That is our answer.